Shortly thereafter that, he became perhaps infamous or notorious as one of the founding members of the Weather Underground, a radical armed struggle group committed to revolution in the United States by means of violence. He spent many years underground, resurfacing, I believe, in 1978, and then thereafter lived a sort of more quiet, less public, but still, deeply meaningful life connected to all kinds of activist causes having to do with, anti-war fighting against, proliferation of nuclear weapons, environmental concerns, et cetera, became a teacher in Albuquerque for many years, a union organizer with the American Federation of Teachers. I became sort of friends with him as a consequence of my research, and there's so much to say about what makes him extraordinary, and I'll highlight just one thing. I'll talk to anybody, young, old, conservative, liberal, radical, believer in the system, cynic about the system, police, FBI, whomever. And then I've asked myself...
I actually talked at the FBI Training Academy.
Right, and I sort of wondered...
In Quantico, Virginia.
I've always sort of been intrigued by and admiring of this quality, and I wonder, what is it rooted in? And then it's not because he's an ego or a ham. He's actually remarkably humble for a guy who's had sort of very pronounced public stature. I mean, partly it's because he's genuinely open-minded and curious and loves hearing alternate points of view, this sort of liberal virtue of being open to dialogue and, being persuaded. But I think most fundamentally it's that he has a very deep sense of who he is and what he believes. And when you know who you are and what you believe, you're not threatened by talking to people who disagree with you. And then, your openness to multiple points of view in some paradoxical way is a function of a set of core convictions about who you are that cannot be sort of threatened by engaging with, someone else. And then in my own life, I've tried to sort of replicate this quality of talking to everybody, bridges across communities, ideologies, political persuasion, young and old. And it's a much more energizing way to live. And then this is the quality about you that, sort of stands out most to me, as I know you not just as a historical figure, but a friend. This tremendous generosity of spirit and openness to the world rooted in an understanding of who you are and what you believe that at some level is unshakable. And that's what gives you the confidence to engage the world. And I think this Occupy Wall Street movement could benefit from this kind of an example, because we can't just talk to ourselves and feel threatened by people who disagree. And the millions of Americans who have some sympathy with this all, don't fully understand it, need to be engaged, brought in, true partners in dialogue if we're going to build an effective movement. So, there was a slogan in the 60s, live like him with respect to Che Guevara, live like Mark with respect to this sort of openness to the world. So that's my introduction.
Wow. Well, Jeremy, that is one of the most beautiful introductions I have ever...
I tried. We had 6 hours of marching today. I'm going to recede with my son.
Okay. That's Arlo, Jeremy's son. That really was a beautiful introduction, and I actually had never kind of seen myself that way, but well, I'll take it.
Your friends and family were not in agreement, so I think
it helps. Yeah. I want to just tell you a little bit about Jeremy, which is that he's a professor at the New School, and he wrote the single best book on the Weather Underground. I learned a lot about my own organization from Jeremy, and he wasn't even born.
We didn't hear on the weather underground.
Right, I'll talk louder. I'm hard of hearing, so I'm very sympathetic. The name of the book is Bringing the War Home, and it's a study, comparative study of the Weather Underground with a parallel phenomenon in Germany called the Red Army faction. And I actually understood more about my organization and my own thinking by reading Jeremy's book, and I thought, wow, this is something. And he among other things, he takes besides a historical and intellectual or history of ideas approach, he also takes a psychological approach, which is very deep, and I really recommend this book. Also, I want to thank Andy, Jacques, I don't know how you're known, Jacques, Andy, for inviting me. And the Yes Men are a great inspiration. Out there in Albuquerque, New Mexico, we look at the DVDs and hear about you giving money back to the people of Bhopal. It's one of the Yes Men stunts, shticks, and it made a difference. It's really good. So I just want to thank Andy and the Yes Lab for bringing me. I worked up a story. I wrote a story for this occasion. It's called, wait, I'm not quite done on introductions. I want to introduce my dear wife, Marla, who's in the back. Who puts up with me and keeps me on the straight and narrow. And I'm sure Marla will have a lot to say during the discussion. I wrote a story for this occasion called Grandpa Was a Terrorist. Marla and I are grandparents. I am a grandfather. And I thought, well, this is an interesting title. In fact, I wanted to call my book. I wrote a book which was published in 2009 called, it has a rather prosaic title, Underground, My Life in STS and Weatherman. And that was a result of my editor, who demanded that be the name. And I wanted to call it Grandpa Was a Terrorist because I thought that would sell more books in Costco. Oh, that's an interesting thing. But, and Marla was against it too. But anyway, tonight is Grandpa Was a Terrorist. So I wrote out the story, or at least I got from 1965 to 1968. The story starts in 1965, and I got to 1968 and it was already 20 pages long. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to do, because I wanted to have a discussion. What I really enjoy, besides actually more than speaking, is just talking with people and questions and discussion and comments. And I like to find out what's on your mind. So I want to leave a lot of time for that. And I think that we all have comments and questions about the current events. Probably some of you. How many of you have been in any action in the last 2 months around Occupy Wall? Well, that's a good number. And I was in my. I participated in a few things in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but today I was really happy to help blockade Wall Street and to be with the students at Union Square and then come down to Foley Square, and it was pretty exciting. And so you may. What I really want us to get to, if we can, is to talk about strategy from now on. What's going to happen? I love Occupy Wall Street, and it's made a big effect, and we can talk about that too. But where do we go? Where do you go? Where do we all go now? So I want to leave time for that. So instead of reading my story, I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch, which I hope will be really short. So, Andy, would you time? Do you have a clock or something? I want to give this. How much time do we have total? We're going to occupy this room, and we'll be here all night. But let's just say roughly 2 hours, maybe. And if I can do this in 15 minutes, let me know when 12 and a half minutes are up. Okay? Okay. So. What I'm going to give you a prologue. This doesn't count against my 15 minutes. So there was this magician who was giving a show, and he asked for a volunteer from the audience, and so this big burly lumberjack kind of guy went up on stage, and the magician said, see that 8-pound sledgehammer over here? Take that sledgehammer and hit me over the head. And the lumberjack says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'll hurt you. The guy said, no, do it. Go ahead, it's part of my act. The guy said, no, I can't do it. So the magician lies down on a bench, and the volunteer, and he says, now you take that hammer and hit me on the head. Because I'm a magician, I know what I'm doing. So the guy takes the hammer, and he goes, whack, and he hits the guy on his head, and he caves his skull in. And the magician goes into a coma. And he's there for a day, and then a week, and a month, a year, 5 years, 8 years. Finally, it's 11 and a half years later, he finally wakes up, and he goes, ta-da! Anyway. I don't know if that story is relevant or not, but that'll be one of the subjects we could discuss at the end. So anyway, so there's this kid who grows up in the suburbs of New York, Maplewood, New Jersey, exactly 14 miles from here, due west, just on the other side of Newark. And I turned 18 years old in June of 1965. And at that time, everybody who turns 18 years old, every male, went and registered for the draft. And I didn't really think much about it because I had a student deferment. I was going to Columbia in the fall. And also my brother was in the military at the time. He had gone to, he was 8 years older, but he had gone to Cornell and come out as a lawyer, but he had been in ROTC. And my father was a lieutenant colonel in the military, in the Army Reserve. And so it was just sort of, that's what everybody did, and that's what I was going to do. Now, I had been aware that, vaguely, that in 1965, the U.S. Invaded Vietnam with main force troops. But it really didn't, I was like a lot of people. It's going about 18-year-old kid going around, I didn't, So when I got to Columbia, I found these other people who were already protesting the war, and they were already learning about the war. They were educating themselves. And I fell in with them because I thought they were absolutely the coolest people around. Let me put it this way. I didn't learn anything about Vietnam from my professors in 2.5 years at Columbia. But I learned an awful lot from these other people. Most of them were red diaper babies. Now, is there anybody present who has never heard that term, red diaper baby? Yeah, it's a little surprise. It means children of communists or socialists or labor people, people raised in the movement. Now, I was not raised in the movement, but these other people at Columbia were, and they knew a lot. They knew about the civil rights movement. Some of them, as kids, had gone on picket lines in the North, or they knew people in the South. Many of them were members of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and there was they had a committee at Columbia, which eventually, very shortly, became the Columbia chapter of Students for a Democratic Society. Now, SDS was the largest radical student organization in the country. From these people who were studying why we're in Vietnam and why is racism so endemic in the society, questions like this. From these people, I learned a number of things. One of which is that the war in Vietnam was not an accident, and it was not well-intentioned. It was part of a much larger policy that had been going on a long time, actually since the founding of the country, but it was an attempt to dominate as much of the world as possible. In fact, that's what the Cold War was, which was the whole country was suffering from. Now, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things in the next 10 minutes. And I'm hoping that you'll kind of keep note of what you'd like me to expand on. Because I could get distracted and start talking now about the Cold War for a while, but I'm not gonna, okay? And this is true of a lot of topics, so keep in mind anything you want to come back to. Another thing I learned from this group, these kids, these red diaper babies, was that liberals were the enemy. Now, this might actually sound odd from our current point of view, because we're trying to bring back a semblance of liberalism in the sense of New Deal government responsibility for the well-being of the people and the economy, the people, the planet. That kind of liberal sensibility we're trying to bring back because the country has gone so far from it. And we can talk about that too. But at that time, see, when they started studying Vietnam, they discovered that it was a war that was given to us by liberals. Kennedy, Johnson, they were domestically and internationally liberals too. But they just were cold warriors, and they also were the liberal wing of this drive for empire. Another thing, which is often forgotten and lost, is that the liberals had betrayed the civil rights movement in 1964. I can't emphasize this betrayal enough. I was more or less apolitical. I mean, I listened to Pete Seeger and I knew Woody Guthrie's songs, but I wasn't involved. I didn't know anybody in the civil rights movement living in New Jersey. I wasn't involved in protest as a high school kid. I even supported Johnson in '64 because I didn't like Goldwater. But what had happened in '64 was totally critical to radical students' understanding of the world. The civil rights movement, which had, has a long history to it, but it had reached a kind of a peak from '61 to '64 with the organizing by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi. That organization, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was a kind of a sister organization to SDS. Now, this is all before I got there. But it sort of entered into the history of the people, the red diaper babies, the kids, the radicals that I fell in with, and also my organization. So SNCC had been successful despite all kinds of violent repression, police, Ku Klux Klan, White Citizens Council, murders, everything. They'd been successful at building a voter rights movement in the worst place of the whole Deep South, which was the Mississippi Delta region. And they had also built statewide what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in Mississippi had no black people in it. So they came to Atlantic City in 1964 to the Democratic National Convention, and they demanded to be seated. And they thought they had worked it out with Hubert Humphrey and the unions and the liberals involved in the Democratic Party. And they were betrayed and cut off in 1964. This event was the turning point in the entire civil rights movement. Now, I wasn't a part of it, but it became my sort of intellectual history at that time. And it gave rise, on the black side, to black power, which was integration is not the answer, the goal, nonviolence is not the strategy, by any means necessary. Malcolm X has a lot to say. Now, it turned out that Malcolm X had his headquarters was in Harlem, right next door to Columbia. So he often came to Columbia. So many of the people I fell in with had heard Malcolm X speak, and they were very deeply affected by him. So black power became a tremendous challenge to white radical kids. How do we respond? Now, the reason I'm going into this now, and I could talk more about it, is because it sort of sets the stage for what's coming next. We spent 3 years, well, actually they had been organizing before I got there, but I spent 3 years organizing with Columbia SDS. And by organizing, I mean things like dorm canvassing, knocking on doors. That's how I was recruited, actually. That's how I fell in with these people. A senior by the name of David Gilbert knocked on my door, and we started talking about Vietnam. He was out recruiting for the predecessor of Columbia SDS. So we did all these things, and we did educational stuff, and we did confrontations, and we developed a strategy. The strategy was to confront the university on its support for the war, mostly in the form of research, but in other forms too. Research for weapons and even sociological studies that would help with counterinsurgency. Also, its expansion into the Harlem community, the university's expansion, which came to us to symbolize racism. We called it institutional racism. So over the course of 3 years, we developed these issues in the sense of educating people and confrontations and all kinds of stuff. Came the spring of 1968. A bunch of stuff happened. It was kind of like a perfect storm. The Vietnamese struck in over 160 places in South Vietnam and gave the lie to the government line that the United States was winning. You know, they were saying the same things about Vietnam that the U.S. has been saying about Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, the light at the end of the tunnel, we're going to win. They don't use that phrase anymore. But it's basically the same thing. We're about to win. We're going to build up the forces of South Vietnam, of Afghanistan, and Iraq, so that they can defend themselves from their evil neighbors. You know, this kind of thing. And the Vietnamese struck in over 160 places at once in a 2-month period, and public opinion in this country flipped to about 30%, from about 30% against the war to 60% in a matter of 2 months. And on March 31st, 1968, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, announced he wasn't going to run for re-election. And this was like a shock. And if we had analyzed it well enough, we would have realized it was a great victory for the anti-war movement back in '68. 4 days later, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. And Harlem went up in flames. And everybody in this whole country, including especially at Columbia, which was right next door to Harlem, had to rethink, who are we? You know, whether you're white, whether you're black, what is this country about? You know? And that was on April 4th. Now, there had been a confrontation brewing at Columbia, and it all hit a sort of an explosive point just 19 days later on April 23rd. And it was unplanned, but suddenly the students, black students, white students, we found ourselves in control of 5 buildings. We occupied 5 buildings for a week. And the administration didn't call in the cops because they were scared of Harlem. Also, one of the buildings was held by the Student Afro-American Society. I could talk about all this in detail if you want, if anybody's interested. The occupation, we formed communes, we had participatory democracy, all the cool stuff that people are doing now, we tried to put into effect. Prefigurative societies, you know. I mean, we hadn't heard, David Graeber hadn't been born yet, but we knew about that kind of stuff. And the term participatory democracy, too, has a great history. It actually comes from SNCC, and I could talk about that. So we held out for a week. The cops came, beat up hundreds of people, including bystanders, professors. The rabbi had both his arms broken. Beat up, hundreds and hundreds of people arrested. There were well over 1,000 in the building, thousands of supporters. And then, as a result of the raid, the whole school went on strike. And that was the largest student strike against the war and against racism up to that point of the era. And it became kind of a symbolic, an icon of student radicalism and sort of a model for other schools to follow, and they did. And at the center of it, there was this 20-year-old kid from New Jersey who was the chairman of, I'd just been elected the chairman of the chapter, and I suddenly became a major international media figure. Mark Rudd, I was just this kid, I don't know. And because New York is the center of world media. And I could talk more about that phenomenon and being picked out as a leader, and if you want to know more. One of the things that had gone into the strike was that we had a faction fight in the chapter right before. Now, if you know anything about leftists, they love faction fights. It's like faction fight. I wrote this whole book, and friends of mine who are essentially apolitical in Albuquerque, New Mexico, read the book, and they said, "Oh, I can't believe all the faction fights you had, it's just," and I said, "Oh, I left 95% out of it, out of the book, because you wouldn't be able to take it. There were so many faction fights." And I'll get to another faction fight that was significant later on. But we had this faction fight between my little grouping, which was called the Action Faction, and the old Red Diaper Babies, who were the Praxis axis. Right? Now, praxis is a German word which I think might, we have the Austrians here. Does it mean the unity of theory and practice?
Or also it can also be experience.
Yeah.
Experience, praxis. But it's something about unity of theory and practice. And it was used by Marxist theoreticians, including Marcuse. And we actually read these people, So they were the praxis axis. Their line was, we got to organize and build the base. That's what we've been doing for years. We got to do that. We got to do education. We got to make sure we have a lot of people and don't get too far ahead. But we said, no, the time is now. We've got to move. We've got to be militant and aggressive, and people will join us. I won't go into it now, but I could talk about the origins of that thinking, and myself involved with a guy by the name of Che Guevara. See, I was in love with Che Guevara. If I would have done anything he would have, anything, I would have done it for him. Doesn't matter. Che Guevara. And Che Guevara was a kind of an action faction kind of guy. Let's go to Bolivia and let's start the revolution in Bolivia. He died around this kind of thinking in October of 1967. And this was already April of 1968, and we were still following that idea. And it got worse. It actually got worse. So our conclusion off of Columbia was, the more militant you are, and the more aggressive, and the more hostile you are to police, who we, at that point, we were saying, we were basically nonviolent, but our rhetoric at Columbia was a little bit over the top. We used to scream at the police, "Up against the wall, motherfuckers, this is a stick-up," which is a quote from Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones. So, well, we were kind of antagonistic, and they didn't appreciate it. In SDS, which grew eventually, over the course of that year, to literally take over the organization. And I found myself as the national secretary of the largest student radical organization in the United States at the height of the war. And at that time, my friends and I started calling ourselves revolutionaries. It wasn't just good enough to be against the war. We had to be against the entire system that gave us the war. So we had to have revolution. So I was no longer a student activist, and I was no longer a radical even. I wasn't anti-war. We even broke up anti-war demonstrations here in New York because they weren't revolutionary enough. No, this is it. It's like, the name of this section of the talk is something like thinking yourself into a corner. You know? I once had a great name, a title for the book, a working title called Idealism and Its Discontents. You know? But anyway, so now all of this, I mean, this story is so, what's that?
You could have gone into a revolutionary situation. I mean, it wasn't like you were thinking yourself into a corner, huh?
I think it was a fantasy. I think we had convinced ourselves that the country as a whole was becoming more revolutionary because every succeeding freshman class at Columbia University from 65 to 68 was more revolutionary, was more radical than the one before. In other words, we had a very thin slice of the world, or of the country. And we thought, well, this shows. And we even built it up to a theory called the, I'm not going to go into it in detail now, but it's called the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And it involved crossing classes, and that it would not only be middle class youth or educated youth, it would be working class youth, because there's an objective basis. You know, there's a whole, I could go into this in detail. It involved a Maoist group that had infiltrated SDS, with which we were in an even bigger faction fight. It was called Progressive Labor Party, and it still exists. They fuck up whatever they can fuck up. And and their goal was to take over SDS. So we had this humongous faction fight in June of 1969, at which the organization split in two. Now, this faction fight had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with most of the 100,000 members of SDS. It was just the people whose heads were spinning around this thing. And it was us, we were the Third World faction, the Weather faction. I could talk about the origin of the name Weathermen. And they were the worker faction, and the workers would make the revolution. And the reason was Marx said it in 1848. So you had all these people with all their ideas, and am I over my 15 minutes? Anyway, forget it. So I guess you got caught up in the story. So my wife, who just got bored and left, she was in SDS at University of California, Riverside, and they didn't even know about this stuff. You know, most of the 100,000 people who were active in SDS took no part in all of this. It was just the leadership, the so-called leadership. And an anarchist friend of mine, who's an activist now, he said, well, doesn't this indicate that people were, were a little bit too passive to what was going on? Did you want to say something?
No.
No. Oh, okay. So, because what happened was, we spun out. After we got in control of the national office, that's when things really got going. Up to now was only prologue, because we figured, okay, 1968, August, Chicago, Democratic National Convention, confrontation with the police. Let's do it again. And let's do it in October of 1968 to coincide with the opening of the trial for the people, the conspiracy. And so we picked the second anniversary of the death of Che Guevara, October 8, 1969, to do this. I mean, we kind of knew that Che was dead, but we didn't know that his ideas were that bad as they were. So we said, we'll carry on Che's strategy by forming a white fighting force that will go to Chicago to fight the cops. We'll bring the war home, off the pig in Chicago. So we had about 500 people in June around the country in this faction called Weathermen, and by October, we organized night and day, and we went into neighborhoods and we did these crazy actions, which, I mean, like running down. I myself was in a a working class, they called them greaser neighborhood, white working class neighborhood, running down the middle of the street with an NLF, National Liberation Front of Vietnam flag. And so, I got knocked unconscious by somebody who kicked me in the kidney, and I wound up in the hospital. What did I learn? You got to fight harder. That's what I learned. It's crazy. That happened in September, and in October we were doing this thing. We had 500 people when we started. When we got to October, we had about 300. Which right there should have told us something. Right? So we had all kinds of confrontations with the cops. I got beaten up, arrested. Everybody got beat up, arrested. Some people got shot, broken arms, just all kinds of stuff. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in bail and court cases. And it's just... So the leadership, we had organized ourselves vertically. Sort of a military type organization. Our model was something called, it's called Marxism-Leninism. It's this old thing, and it had a kind of a military structure to it. Right? You have anyway. So the top, of which I was a member, which at that time naturally was called the Weather Bureau, had a meeting, one among many, and we decided that Chicago, October '69 was a necessary defeat. That you always have defeats before you have victory, and that now we have to do it even more. This is what I mean about thinking yourself into a corner. Because the people of the world are already in armed struggle against American imperialism. The Panthers are being attacked because they're talking about revolution and by any means necessary, and the revolution has come, off the pig. Time to pick up the gun, off the pig. And so I just wanted to create this environment for you that we were in, and we said, well, we don't want to abandon these people, even though the Panthers told us we were out of our minds. I think Fred Hampton called us Custeristic. We were Custeristic. And I told you this is going to be funny, right? And the Cubans told us back in the summer, don't do this. This is crazy. And the Vietnamese, who were the paragons of armed struggle, because they were beating the Americans, they said, unite as many people as possible against the war. It's a logical thing to want from their point of view. We said, no, that's not good enough. We know that revolution is coming. If the time is here, it could happen, right? And there's a great chance it's happening. So we have to push it as far as it'll go. So, this small, tiny group of people, of whom I was a member, decided we were going to end the largest student radical organization in the United States at the height of the war, 1969. So we closed the national office, and we closed the regional offices, of which there was one at 131 Prince Street over here before it became high rent. And we set about building the underground, because that's the next stage, armed struggle. Because we know that Che Guevara had told us that armed struggle is coming. We have to defeat the United States through armed struggle. That's how they're going to, I mean, the Vietnamese are doing it, and it'll be 2 or 3 many Vietnams, and the Panthers are fighting for their lives, and we've got to, and it's, I mean, I can hardly believe I'm standing here and telling you this story. So we shut down SDS. And my friends and I started off to become guerrilla warriors in the belly of the beast. And I could talk more about that, but one of the first things that happened on March 6, 1970, about 5 minutes from where we're sitting here, a townhouse blew up, security precautions, because we were all fugitives by then. Along about 75 the war ended, and at that point I said, this is pointless. And it took me two more years to come up, and I turned myself in 77, and nothing happened. All the federal felonies were dropped because of government illegalities. They had been dropped back in 73, and that would never have happened now. There are no rights of the accused now if the word terrorism is used. Nothing happened. I came out. I had some small state charges. They were settled, and eventually, I had a child born underground, another one coming. My wife and I at the time, not Marla, but someone else, moved back to New Mexico. It's one of the places we had lived. And I built a new life. I was a teacher at a community college for 26 years, and I taught remedial math and English and other subjects. I've been an organizer and an activist around a lot of stuff, anti-nuclear, Native American solidarity, peace, Central America stuff, union organizing, environmental organizing. And my latest incarnation is I'm a card-carrying member of the Democratic Party. And I'm operating under a belief, which Marla had a lot to do in, that we can make a lot of progress by electing progressives to office, which we've actually done in New Mexico, and that our goal should be to reform the Democratic Party. So there's more to the story, but that's it. Ta-da! Yes.
Yeah. One question is, because in one way you said, like, you know, of course, a young group of crazy guys are starting to do a revolution, but on the other hand, like people from Black Panthers, they told me, also like in Europe, it was not only one part, it was the whole time, you know, where things were developed more up in influence each other. So you said, you know, you're fighting the cops, but also the cops fighting the students, you know? Like
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
And like what the Black Panthers told me about the coin toss bro, or what happened, it was a very bad thing what happened, you know, that also what happened to Abby Hoffman, for example, you know, smuggling drugs, or the shut down Black Panthers just out of nothing in the back. It doesn't happen. And so things happen.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
what I'm missing.
And part of it though is a kind of paranoia and an overreaction on the part of the authorities. You know, like one of the things I left out in this was that President Nixon was so paranoid about the revolutionary threat that among the targets of the plumbers was not only the Democratic National Committee, but the Weathermen, was lawyers, and also Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrists, and stuff like that. That they were so paranoid that they took us probably almost as seriously as we took ourselves. You know, which doesn't mean that we were an actual threat. They just liked that game. You know, and the overreaction, well, some of the overreaction is predictable. If the Panthers, for example, running around with guns and yelling, the revolution has come, off the pig, it's predictable that the government's going to kill them. I mean, that may sound like a sort of a hard-hearted thing to say, but if you're black and you run around with guns, they're going to kill you. And the truth of the matter is that most black people did not support the Panthers because they knew they would die. And one of the problems, I occasionally tell a sophisticated audience this, because once I told it to an unsophisticated audience, and I got my ass handed to me, but one of the problems with the Panthers was that they lost their base. Because of the repression and because of the rhetoric, which produced the repression. And so they had no base left, so they had to turn to the white, radical, new left as their base, and that was no base at all. And that's a part of the history that never gets told. So It's it's part of the nexus of screaming about violence and revolution and that kind of thing. The more nonviolent you are, the more it might have a chance at winning support and disarming, not exactly disarming the enemy, they're going to kill you one way or another, but at least you're not giving them ammunition. Because we constantly gave our enemies ammunition, and we constantly did what they wanted us to do, which was, for example, destroy SDS in the name of armed struggle. But you're right. When there's other groups around doing this kind of thing, you want to support them. And one of the great mysteries about Germany, which may be Jeremy has a lot to say about this nexus of violence and repression in his book. Because that's really what was going on in Germany, was violence and repression, more violence, more repression. But one of the great mysteries of this whole thing is why in Germany there were successive waves of generations of idealistic young people who joined. So in our case, it was just this first burst of people from Columbia and University of Michigan and Kent State and a few other places. But there it was successive waves, and it went on for something like 22 years. It's just insane. And then, of course, they were in support of the Palestinians and the Red Army, the Brigata Rossi in Italy. And, it all sort of fed itself in its own little circular, closed thinking. Germany was no closer to revolution than the U.S. was. This revolution thing was a wonderful youthful fantasy that we had. And, I read old people like Chris Hedges now, who says, the revolution is here. This is what revolution looks like. It's the end of capitalism. And I think, why are you feeding this stupid shit? That's what I think. We're not revolutionary. This is not a revolutionary. Germany wasn't revolutionary. It's a wonderful fantasy. But my conclusion is we have to figure out practical ways of transforming the 60% of public opinion that is for stuff like health care and controlling the banks and ending the wars. How can we transform that public opinion into power? That's a question that I think of every day when I wake up and when I go to bed and while I'm sleeping. How do we do this thing? And that's our next step, I think. But I'm not for promoting fantasies of revolution. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in terms of opening it up to also if there are people here who wanted to comment.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if it ever occurred to you at the time that the vertical structure was problematic, that there shouldn't be or possibly wasn't the best plan to have a very small group of people doing this, or if it was just happening so fast and that this was the way things were done at the time.
No, it was quite conscious. It was built on a military model.
Right.
Yeah.
But so were you conscious that of the possibility that a horizontal
would have been better?
Would have been better, or were you?
No, we actually threw out the idea of participatory democracy. And we said, SDS is too mushy. We need hardcore military type organization. It was a conscious decision. It was totally the wrong decision. But it was quite conscious.
Is everybody in agreement with you?
Well, the people who weren't in agreement left.
No, I mean nowadays. Your former...
Oh, my former... There's a lot of disagreement among us. First of all, we're all sort of like a family of brothers and sisters who went through this thing together, our lives, and whenever any of us sees any of us, we're still great. But I would say that I've gone probably the furthest of anybody on this self-criticism. And part of the reason is
There would be an enormous amount of agreement around core points. And then I think other people in the group are more protective of a sense of legacy. And then they don't want young people to think it was just a bunch of delusional lunatics. But then there's also a sort of paranoia about controlling the reputation and the meaning of their past. And it goes back to what I said in my introduction. Like, you're not self-conscious in that sense, and can, have had a private reckoning, both with a personal sense of guilt and a sort of historical assessment of what worked strategically, what didn't. And you're capable of being honest with yourselves and the world in ways that perhaps other people haven't gotten to. And then there's still comrades of his in jail who are doing life in prison for a set of...
Oh, I left that part of the story. I left that out of the story. That's part of the story I didn't even go into. The events of 1981.
Right.
And then some people feel, guilty that it's, not them in prison, and then don't want to betray their comrades by disavowing a set of ideas.
Yeah. I mean, David Gilbert, who was my mentor, my friend at Columbia, is still in prison. And that's because of stuff that happened in '81 subsequent to all this. And it was a robbery that took place in Nyack, New York, a Brinks truck in which 2 cops and a guard were killed. And it was in conjunction with a group called the Black Liberation Army, which was a sort of an offshoot of the original New York Panthers. So David is still in prison. And to this day, he guards the legacy to the extent that he won't come out and say that this wasn't a valid revolutionary act. And he even has a book coming out this month called Love and Struggle. So if you want to take a look at it, and you can find all kinds of stuff on the internet from Dave Gilbert. And I love this guy dearly. And I once, Marla and I went and visited him in prison, and it's like, in terms of breaking with the past, no. So, as you said, there's degrees of it, and then you don't want to break with those people still in prison, And black people died behind this, and it's like it's a whole thing. Marta, do you want to talk to this?
Forgive me if I get a little bored with the past. I just want to kind of cut to the chase and find out, because we live in Albuquerque, so we're a little out of the loop. Even though we do have an Occupy Albuquerque, which is called Unoccupied Albuquerque, because of our native population being offended by the word occupy. Is there a theory of change in the minds of the folks taking to the streets? Is there an idea of what they're struggling for? Is there an idea of what that looks like? Does anybody want to speak to that? I mean, beyond the obvious, we want the just banking system, we want general economic and social justice in our culture. But what does that look like, and what is getting there look like?
Well, I don't know what the end product looks like, but in terms of what getting there looks like, you see examples of it every day when you walk the streets of New York City and see these people putting these things into practice. There's the whole horizontal decision-making going on, there's consensus, there's participatory democracy happening. And without these methods, whatever the future's going to be isn't going to be any brighter.
So, would you mind standing up and just, it'll be easier.
All right, so I don't know if there's a concrete idea among the group of what the end product should be or what exactly we want it to be. Obviously we've heard, we want better banking systems and all that. But in terms of what getting there looks like, you see it every day in New York, the way the situations are being handled, how even in the face of violence from the police, the protest has remained peaceful. Just even small things like the consensus decision making and the horizontal structure of the organization, that's what getting there looks like. And I mean, maybe we don't know exactly this is exactly what we're fighting for and this is what it's going to be like when it happens. The fact that this many people are coming together and realizing we want a better world and we know that this is something like, and this is a way to get it, kind of shows it. I mean, there's something there.
Okay, so we're talking more about the means. And is there an idea that these means are going to spread throughout the country?
I mean, they are spreading throughout the country. It started in New York, now it's in practically every major city in the U.S. There's some worldwide movements adopting it as well.
How do we go from where we are now to some future?
I think that's the question.
You came all the way down from Boston, didn't you?
Yeah.
Sean came all the way from Boston for the action today and for this discussion. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, actually, does anybody have, as long as we got him on the hot seat, does anybody want to ask him some questions? Have you been at Liberty Park quite a bit?
A little bit. I mean, I know this is like the worst excuse and kind of contrary to everything the movement stands for, but I've had to, work and go to school and do all that. So
yeah, especially if you're 250 miles away.
Yeah. No, but I've gone down there a few times, and the thing that you said that sort of rang out with me was the what you call it, sort of like the faction battles. Or like,
do you have factions?
Yeah, all over the place.
What are the factions?
Anarchists are a big one. There's a very strong anarchist population in Boston. They're really behind the movement.
Well, wait a minute. Good anarchists or bad anarchists? A good anarchist is somebody who doesn't advocate violence, and a bad advocate, no, anyway.
You have both, but it's stayed peaceful for the most part. So there's them. We have labor unions down there as well, which is really cool to see their support, but they tend to not exactly agree with the anarchist side all that often.
What do they want?
They're more focused on sort of like more job creation, whereas anarchists are more focused on like everyone's like, yeah, banking system doesn't work right now. Labor unions are like, how are we going to reform this? Most of the anarchists are like, let's tear it down.
Tear it down.
Why do we need capital in the first place? So
Yeah.
it's sort of ideological differences that cause problems.
Cool. Any other questions? No. Okay, thank you, Sean. Thanks. That was pretty cool. Yeah. Yes, did you want to say something?
She's had her hand up for a minute.
Oh.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, the best thing about this, that the most interesting thing is I've been going to these lectures, and I came down on the first week, day 4 of the occupation with Andy in the room. I was one of the people. And it felt formless, and I had been to Burning Man about a month before, and I thought it was like Burning Man with cement, because it felt...
It was like Burning Man what?
With cement. It just had that kind of, similar thing going on.
Without the sand.
Yeah, without the sand. I mean, that was my, having gone on this other experience of an open experience, but what was amazing, like a week later, it had like formed like a catalyst, and I'm a very like intuitive person, so I just like smelled, this is gonna stick, this is gonna change. It was like, there was like an intuitive, like, they had their center going, they had a MAC center, they had, you could just feel the thing forming, you could feel it beginning to solidify, and that was interesting because I'm very much into comedy, that's my world.
Into what?
Comedy. Comedians used to speak, like, I'm in my 50s, so I used to watch comedians be political. We've been a huge period, I'm a big follower of avant-garde and comedy in New York, but nobody was saying anything, and I was thinking there's just been this enormous amount of complacency, and even the top comics, I love Louis C.K., Mark Maron, these different comics, they're talking about their divorce and their middle-age crisis. They're not talking about what's going on. There's been so much complacency that this just formed like this amazing catalyst where all these people have been grumbling about, like, we're out of a job, we're broken. It just started to, like, you could just feel, I'm very, like, you just feel this shift. And that's been the most amazing thing about it, like, that it was, kids and the whole thing. Which in the 60s, it was kids too, and it looked formless and tattooed and hippie dancing and drugs and all that stuff too, but it still was a catalyst for the rest of society. And that's what I have to say, thanks for this. And
I feel the same way too. It's been really exciting, and it's made me realize how much I have, and a lot of people in my age group have seen things as sort of neutral. This is the way they are, but in fact...
I didn't think there'd be revolution to the last roll of toilet paper went, because that's people. I thought we're having like the depression of cable TV. That's what's going on. Like, people are like sitting back going, this is terrible, and they're not doing anything.
And this has been, it just wasn't, that's all I'm saying, thanks.
Yeah. Did you have a comment back there? No, okay. Yes, and then Jeremy.
No, I just wanted to say, I think part of the resonance is that the unemployment rate is so high, especially for young people. It's just unprecedented, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much resonance with this frustration. You know, if you get out of college with a degree, it doesn't mean shit. I mean, and then if you don't, it means even less. So I mean, I think that's a real part of it. Is that the economic terrain has really, over the last 30 years in this country, is incredibly changed.
Like in Berlin, my neighborhood, like the last 2 years, I think there were thousands of people from New York are moving to Berlin. And everybody tells me the same, it's cheaper, I have insurance, I don't have to pay for education, you just can live and you have a beer in the street. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So things are, I think, all over. And the same I heard. That was the first day I came to New York, and then last week I was there. And the same people, they told me the same. They said, like, it's unfair. You go out of universities, you have 90,000, 100,000. It's criminal. As for Europeans.
And 40 years ago, nobody had that kind of debt. It didn't exist. You could be a poor kid at Columbia University, you wouldn't come out with anything like that. Right?
Occupy NYU, that's what I say. They're trials, they're bastards. I'm sorry, I just think they're bastards on many levels, and I don't know why I'm going to say that.
Yeah. Jeremy, did you?
Yeah, like a lot of, young militants in Occupy Wall Street would disagree with you very vehemently, including many of my students. And then there is this slogan that things have to be taken like as hard, as far, as fast as possible, which sounds like a pure echo of the action faction. So given who you were and things you believe deeply, what kind of answer do you have to the sort of young militants today who you could argue are one of the drivers of the movement? Without the anti-authoritarian spirit, the rule-breaking, the conflict, this would feel passively the sort of advisable in your view, and then how do you argue that a line should be drawn to somebody who's as committed today as you were 40 years ago?
Right. Well, I have a soft answer to that and a hard answer. The soft answer is, oh, your motives are so wonderful, and I know what you're thinking, and but don't blow it, because that's the soft answer. The hard answer is there's only two kinds of people who advocate a diverging from nonviolent strategy. Either people who are very stupid or cops. That's my hard answer, because I. What? Yeah, well, the stupid thing doesn't go over very well with the people who aren't cops, because they don't like to be told they're stupid, But
Vietnamese, what about the Vietnamese?
I mean, are there situations where that's not so?
Well, I don't think there's any Vietnamese involved in armed struggle at the moment, But Palestinians, I've told Palestinians I think armed struggle is stupid. Because it just unites the Israelis, public against them. And that if they had started 40 years ago with solely a nonviolent strategy, they probably would have a state by now, because it would have divided the Israeli public rather than united them. And in this country, any kind of violence of any sort, like breaking a window in a Starbucks or anything, is construed to be terrorism. Because that's the definition that it's there. And, I can see the logic of violence against property. There's a certain sort of raw, rational logic to it, but it doesn't produce a movement. So I usually say to young people who do have, and I'm in this debate all the time. I'm in and out of the Northwest, where it's really concentrated in places like Eugene and Portland and Arcata. I have this argument all the time, and I try to tell them our goal is to build a mass movement. So we try to figure out a strategy based on how best to build a mass movement, not on our feelings. Yes.
To speak kind of to what your wife was saying earlier, and all the cameras are going to make me stumble more than I ordinarily would, I think. But, so first of all, the way you describe your top-down leadership in Weather Underground
Yeah.
sounds not entirely different from like a military dictatorship.
From military.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
And so, and about what do young people today want? I think what young people want is kind of like the idealized America that we were sold in the early 80s, of like our parents' impression of their own experience. And I don't think that's possible because the only reason you got that was, the only reason you could go to school for cheap was because of World War II. The United States basically was the economy of last resort after World War II. And so we were able to build up a lot and to give our people a good quality of life. But now, the only way you can really make good money is, I mean, you can have a career, but there aren't that many of those. Like the real big money is in robbing everyone else.
Yeah.
And so,
That's true.
the only,
Which
yeah,
right.
we're getting closer to
That's
it.
what it is.
Yeah.
And so,
Which is why the number one major is business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
sure. And
Yeah.
I think what Chris Hedges says is actually correct in that there is revolution happening all around us every day. And my contention is that rather than a mass movement, what we want is useful policy. Right now, significant amounts of currently enacted policy are not favored by the population. But who cares? Nobody's doing anything to stop it. What we need is effective political leadership who won't sell their people down the river to have a Lockheed Martin factory in their district. And so, I don't have a point. That's all.
But could I take your point and run with it a little bit? Because
Yeah.
it's, yeah. I would add one thing to your analysis of the advantage we had post-World War II. We were not only experiencing the product of prosperity post-World War II, but we were also inheritors of the result of class struggle that had taken place in the 30s and had sort of been stopped by World War II, right? So that what happened was that capital grew all power as his Secretary of Defense. But when you think about it, it's no surprise at all because the new president was probably told there will be no change in your military policy, right? And it's a big surprise to us that he doesn't choose Krugman and Stiglitz as his advisors, who every Monday and Friday in the New York Times, you can read it and it's obvious that they're right, you know, but he's given Geithner and Summers, and they have their disagreements, but they gave us the same old. Maybe that was dictated also. In other words, we haven't done the power analysis, but I'll suspect if we do the power analysis of how policy is made, we'll find that we're up against something so big that one president and an occasional progressive congressperson can't do it. We have to have a mass political movement. And it's going to take the rest of your lives. And I'll be dead. Okay, now people are going to, now I can see the anger rising. Yes?
It's funny that you said that. My question is going to be, I wanted to hear your thoughts about the usefulness or appropriateness of anger, of using anger in social movements.
As what?
To motivate people, to galvanize. It seems like it can be a motivator or to galvanize people, but it also seems like a volatile force, like it can go too far. And I just was wondering about.
I've thought a lot about anger because at one point in my life I thought righteous anger was key to the whole strategy, right? There's an ancient saying that I very deeply believe in, which is, he who the gods would destroy can first make angry. And I think that anger is always internally corrosive and destructive to what you're trying to do. And that probably, in almost all cases, maybe except a few controlled ones, it's best to control anger. You know, President Obama's election was a brilliant model of controlling any form of anger that might ever arise, because he made a decision very early on that this country would not elect an angry black man. So not once did we ever see an angry black man. And I'm sure that the guy must have got angry about some of the shit he's had to eat. You know? But he's never shown anger. So I think anger is a very dangerous emotion. And if we do use it in our movement, it's got to be very carefully planned out and controlled, because otherwise it's going to backfire. Generally speaking, our fellow Americans don't like it. Unless they're allowed, you know, unless it's sanctioned. 911, you know, that kind of thing. But they don't like unsanctioned anger. We have to worry. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You know, it's way different from living on the Upper West Side. It really is. Except for Santa Fe. Santa Fe is the same, exact. But, I mean, no, it's the same voting pattern. It's 70, 80% Democratic in Santa Fe. Jerry Nadler on the Upper West Side probably never has a Republican opponent, as far as I know. And in Santa Fe, our congressperson in Santa Fe, which is in Albuquerque, never has a Republican running against him. It's the same. But in Albuquerque, I have to think every minute about my neighbors and what they're thinking about this thing, you know? And I'm pretty assured people don't like anger. Yeah. Did you have a comment?
We wanted to say that you mentioned the power structure surrounding President Obama.
The power structure?
Surrounding President Obama.
Yeah.
How he inherited some power structure.
Yeah.
Except that he has been very despiseful of his base too.
He had what?
Been very despiseful of his base. He has closed the door to the people.
Oh yeah, yeah. He made decisions, and I don't. Okay. Those decisions are totally. I have no idea why he made those decisions. Why did he cut us out? For example, his youth base, you know, that worked so hard for him. You know, why did he disappoint us so bad? You know, why did he cut out Howard Dean? This is one of the weirdest stories of all. There was a great book written by a young reporter named Ari Berman. It's called Herding Donkeys. Has anybody seen it? It's really a great book. He writes for The Nation. You know, he opens the book with a scene in Grant Park on November 3rd, 2008, where Obama's going down a line of about 50 dignitaries, and he's shaking everybody's hand and thanking him. He comes to Howard Dean, and he says, "Hey, everybody, I want everybody to hear this." This is the story Howard Berman said. "Howard, you're the reason I was elected tonight." And then the book is about that, right? And it's also about the next thing he did was cut Howard Dean completely out. Howard Dean had no part in the administration. He expected to be Secretary of Health or in charge of the reform. Cut him out. Why did they make that? To me, it's inexplicable. I don't know why they made that decision. I do point out that here were people who were very smart in running one of the best campaigns in American history, primary or general election, running a black man successfully, and they made a bunch of great decisions, and then suddenly they made a bunch of terrible decisions. Maybe they're just kind of stupid, or maybe they were told what the decisions are, or maybe they could count votes in Congress. I know they can count votes in Congress. You know? So it's much more complicated in terms of power analysis. We're just beginning to understand. I think for most of the young people, it's been a shock. How bad the Obama administration. For me, it's been a shock because I drank the Kool-Aid too. You know, I was involved in magical thinking. The magical thinking was that we worked really hard for 4 months, and then we have a president, and then we can go back to our lives, and the president would do everything for us. That's called magical thinking. Yeah.
Okay. You spoke about the national movement, something, and I think you used the word like political. I think it has to be a much more cultural thing because there are ideas in our culture that just don't work in a way that everyone can have a decent standard of living. Like when, as you grow up, you like are told to share as a little kid, and then you're told to live, you must make profit for yourself. And it's not an equality type culture. It doesn't promote people, it promotes persons.
Individuals.
Yeah, and to enforce that, we create this, in my mind, a great, it's not completely imaginary, but it's mostly imaginary divide between community living and the individual. And we say, if you want to be a free person, you have to compete with your neighbor. And I disagree. You can be free and cooperate with your neighbor and create something better. And so it has to go beyond politics and into the culture and into the homes and show people that they don't need to grow up this way and they don't need to stay in these patterns of thinking that we've had for centuries, effectively. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yes, and then, yes.
Just to add on to what he's saying, I think one of the biggest issues that we're up against with Occupy Wall Street is that it takes a community to build that, what you're talking about. It takes one person to destroy it. That's the problem, is that the thing that's uniting the banks is greed and money. What's uniting Occupy Wall Street? You have all these different factions, and everyone believes different things. How do you get this mass movement to come together when the only thing we have in common is being people? There's so many other differences. How do you unite people on that deepest, most base level? And how do you get different groups to define what's right and what's wrong?
I was going to say that I think there's, besides that, there's a problem that I see as an outsider, kind of an outsider from Colombia, is that I don't understand why, besides what had happened with Obama, young people still want some reforms of democracy, or still want democracy, or still want a better government, but they still want a government or democracy. That's a big problem because they don't are touching the core problems or the structural problems of structural problems of American society.
Did you say you're from Colombia?
Yes.
Colombia, a friend of mine is living in Colombia now, and you have the most wonderful system within a city of sharing costs of interest of water and electricity, where a city is divided into 6 regions. This is like social democracy in action. 6 areas from poorest to richest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 6 is the richest. And they, in terms of municipal services and electricity and water and things like that, 6 subsidizes 1. 5 subsidizes 2. 4 subsidizes 3. A simple system like that. Social democracy. I love it. And Bogota has a transportation system.
Well, it doesn't work like that. We have also the most expensive way of transport of all Latin America, and it's not as good as they're saying. And also, the 6 thing and the 1 certification, it's like it highlights the differences.
Yeah.
Between people.
Okay. Did you have a comment on that, John?
Well, I just wanted to say nice to meet you after 40 years. I was president of SDS in 1970 and shut the university down after Nixon invaded Cambodia.
Where?
Ohio State.
Ohio State.
Columbus. Nice
Post Weathermen.
Post Weathermen, but we were still inspired by. The last 10 years I've been involved in relationship coaching, and now I'm teaching a program in high schools called Healthy Relationships 101. Kind of relationship ed before sex ed. And we use Marshall Rosenberg's work. I don't know if you've heard of him. There's a book called Nonviolent Communication.
Yes.
It's extraordinary. They used it in the UN. And so that's That's what I'm up to now, but I guess my question for you is, where is this going? I mean, I was excited by Wall Street. After 40 years, is something happening? And even the organization after he did, I mean, I'll often just say Nixon or Reagan when I'm talking about it. They all kind of blend. Well, I don't know if this, you know, I mean, I have a couple questions. One is where you, I got here late, where do you think this can possibly go, because it's spread around the world, and you're saying it's important for people to organize. There's no leader, but I mean, the leader to me is that the greed that is ravaging the planet is the message, and it's got how it stops. I don't know how it stops, because power's an aphrodisiac. I just don't know what a person does with, let's say, a small amount of money. Let's say $10 million. Where am I going to put it? How many pairs of shoes can I buy? Where is it going in my grave? How many relatives do I have? I mean, I just wonder if this is like an aphrodisiac. I mean, what's Bloomberg been doing for? He corralled his way into a third term, or strong-armed his way. But he could have given $4 billion to the city while he was in office.
The richest man in New York.
And gone down in history as a guy who's, we're $2 billion short education. Here you go. But the question is, do you see some sort of leadership arising out of the Wall Street, the Occupy Wall Street, and if so, what kind of unifying theme could it have? Because I think there's a huge undercurrent. It's just a massive undercurrent of anger and dissatisfaction and the lie of the American dream and what we've done around the planet since the beginning of this country. And it's sort of like, you know, the chickens are coming home to roost, but how do you go up against these billionaires who just, the power's unspeakable?
Do you want to answer that for me?
Yes, sorry. The only thing I can say, maybe anybody in the room can speak to this, is I've done a lot of reading recently about narcissism and narcissists. And the narcissists see other people as objects. They have no empathy. So, yeah, I was thinking a lot when, Dick Cheney, how does a Dick Cheney happen? What happened to him on the playground? What creates that? And I'm serious, this is the problem.
It's true.
Fucking problem. This is the problem. And narcissists see other people as objects. And there's like, they don't have direct relationship with other human beings. So there's an empty hole to fill. Like, they cannot consume and take in enough. They see it and they can give a shine. And we have a tremendously narcissistic culture. It is the United States, and this is the issue. And it's a very difficult thing because the narcissist, when you have that as your entity, how do you get through to that entity? How do you get through? They can only, I think they realize if their source is in danger, they begin to react like, I cannot take anymore, or I cannot get this thing that I need from this other object. It's that abstract, but that's the thing. Because I think about it, like when the CEO's salaries have jumped in recent years to like 44 million, 33, who does enough work in a day to earn that kind of money? And New York, we're sitting in the middle of it. It's like, what kind of entitlement do we see? What kind of like luxury items, luxury apartments, and luxury, like, how do you get through to somebody this entitlement? And I definitely think it's narcissism. Like, what created that, and how do you get through to somebody who sees you as an object and has no empathy? And maybe this is the guy to talk to.
It's the same thing with sexual violence.
Yeah, everything. Somebody's an object. You're an object. Yeah, and it's definitely a growing thing that's been coming into culture. And it's like,
could I take on this?
please.
Yeah. I think back to Che Guevara. Che Guevara wrote a book called Man and Socialism in Cuba. And I read this book as a kid and I said, wow, we're creating a new socialist man in Cuba. I read the book from Che Guevara, my hero. And people will be totally altruistic. There's no need for economic incentives, just moral incentives, right? Of money, which will be campaign finance. These are going to be the three demands. And I think that if we spend the rest of our lives organizing around these things, and in terms of my neighbors, the most I can ever ask my neighbors to do is to go out and vote every 2 years. I can't ask them to change their lives. I can't ask them to become non-narcissistic. I can't ask them to cooperate. All I can ask my neighbors to do is vote for Eric Riego, who's my candidate, right? And I don't want to change their lives. I can't tell them how to live. I can't tell them it would be great to come to a General Assembly every afternoon at 5. You know? I know they wouldn't come anyway. One of the greatest disappointments of my life was for 15 years I was a union organizer at my workplace, and I couldn't get my fellow workers to understand that a union is a democratic form. And we talk about it, we work on it, and we say we elect our own president, we make our own policies, you know, we do this, we do that. And then when they finally get it, they say, well, I don't want any part of it, because I don't want to go to meetings. I'm not criticizing them. They had other things to do. They wanted to get drunk. They wanted to work in a garden. They wanted to go play football. They wanted to watch professional TV. They want to do it. They want to go to Mormon church. They want to do this, do that. All I'm asking people to do is vote for a progressive candidate once every 2 years.
I'm starting in telling you that I was not born here. I was raised in a different country with a different mentality. And I've been living here for about 5 years. I think I can already start making a little bit of an opinion for myself and the point of view that I have. I don't believe that the U.S. is ready for a mass movement because I believe that the average person here doesn't care enough. I think that the average person
take in enough. They see other, and they can give a shine, you know, and we have a tremendously narcissistic culture. It is the United States, I mean, and this is the issue, and it's a very difficult thing because a narcissist, when you have that as your entity, how do you get through to that entity? How do you get through? They can only, I think they realize if their source is in danger, they begin to react like, I cannot take anymore, or I cannot get this thing that I need from this other object. It's that abstract. But that's the thing. I mean, because I think about it, like when the CEO's salaries have jumped in recent years to like 44 million, 33. Who can earn? Who does enough work in a day to earn that kind of money? And New York, we're sitting in the middle of it. It's like, what kind of entitlement do we see? What kind of like luxury items and luxury apartments and luxury, like, how do you get through to somebody this entitlement? And I definitely think it's narcissism. Like, what created that, and how do you get through to somebody who sees you as an object and has no empathy? And maybe this is the guy to talk to.
It's the same thing with sexual violence.
Yeah, everything. Somebody's an object. You're an object. Yeah, and it's definitely a growing thing that's been coming in the culture.
Could I take on these? Yeah. I think back to Che Guevara. Che Guevara wrote a book called Man and Socialism in Cuba. And I read this book as a kid and I said, aha, we're creating the new socialist man in Cuba. I read the book from Che Guevara, my hero. And you know, people will be totally altruistic. There's no need for economic incentives, just moral incentives, right? It didn't work that way in Cuba. And I'm at the point now, I'm about to die. I'm 64 years old. I'm going to die pretty soon, you know? Pretty soon. Sooner than you think, Marla, I'll be dead. 30 years, 40 years, okay? I'm going to die. But I think... You can have the last word. But I think that something can happen short of changing narcissism and whatever appears to be human nature and greed and things like this. I look to the Tea Party. They represent about 25% of public opinion. They organized like crazy almost instantaneously after they were formed, and they got power almost instantaneously, and they control the Congress, or at least one house of the Congress of the United States. How did they do it? They organized electorally. That's all they did.
Well, they have to have power behind them as well.
We got George Soros. Don't worry about it. Money isn't the problem. You know, I mean, okay, they had the Koch brothers, and and the media, and it's a small step. But they also had a crisis that was formed by the greed of corporations and of capital, and it wasn't the government. It obviously was not the government policies that caused this economic crisis, and yet 25% of the population still believes it. Even your mayor believes that it was the banks being forced by the government to lend to black people. I mean, this is totally crazy. It has nothing to do. Economists have debunked this a million times, but even this guy believes it. 25% of the population believes a bunch of horse shit. And they organized and organized and organized and got some people elected to Congress, and they control the Congress. And they did it in less than 2 years. We represent public opinion, which is generally 60% for health care for all. It's generally 60 or more percent against wars and against military spending. It's for control of the banks. Public opinion is on our side, but we refuse to organize and get people elected. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm putting all my time and effort and money into organizing to get a progressive congressman elected for the first time in history. And it's a long shot, but it could happen, this sweep. Did you read Jeffrey Sachs in the New York Times review section on Sunday? He argued that this is the beginning, Occupy Wall Street is the beginning of a third progressive wave. And it's caused by the concentration of capital, the greed, exactly everything we understand, but that there will be 3 demands. He doesn't tell how it's going to happen, but I think it's going to happen electorally. There are going to be 3 demands: cut back on wars and military spending, equalize incomes through taxation and through distribution, and control the political power of money, which will be campaign finance reform and all these. These are going to be the 3 demands. And I think that if we spend the rest of our lives organizing around these things, and in terms of my neighbors, the most I can ever ask my neighbors to do is to go out and vote every 2 years. I can't ask them to change their lives. I can't ask them to become non-narcissistic. I can't ask them to cooperate. All I can ask my neighbors to do is vote for Eric Griego, who's my candidate, right? And I don't want to change their lives. I can't tell them how to live. I can't tell them it would be great to come to a General Assembly every afternoon at 5, I know they wouldn't come anyway. One of the greatest disappointments of my life was for 15 years I was a union organizer at my workplace, and I couldn't get my fellow workers to understand that a union is a democratic form. And we'd talk about it, and we'd work on it, and we'd say we elect our own president, we make our own policies, we do this, we do that. And then when they finally get it, they'd say, well, I don't want any part of it, because I don't want to go to meetings. I'm not criticizing them. They had other things to do. They wanted to get drunk. They wanted to work in their garden. They wanted to go play football. They wanted to watch professional TV. They want to go to Mormon church. They want to do this, do that. All I'm asking people to do is vote for a progressive candidate once every 2 years. That's all I'm asking. And I think it's realistic. Yes?
I was not born in the U.S.
What's that?
I said, I'm starting to tell you that I was not born here. I was raised in a different country with a different mentality, and I've been living here for about 5 years. I think I can already start making a little bit of an opinion for myself and the point of view that I have. I don't believe that the U.S. is ready for a mass movement, because I believe that the average person here doesn't care enough. I think that the average person doesn't feel connected to anything bigger, whatever that might be. And I believe that in order to have a mass movement, you have to speak to the masses. You need someone who speaks. You need someone who speaks to each of you. When I talk about basics. No one needs an apartment for $15,000 a month. And even if you have the money, you should not be spending it. But when I speak to you about 3 basics, like the Maslow's pyramid.
Like the what?
When I speak the Maslow's pyramid, you know, the 3 basic
Madoff.
needs, yes, of human beings, what is it? It's physiological, it's food and water. If I speak to you about this, you connect with me because you know you don't want to be thirsty, you know you don't want to be hungry. If I speak to you about safety, who doesn't need a house with windows and heating system? Air conditioning is an extra, but you need a heater. And then you need love and friends. That's what you connect with. If I speak to you about those 3 things, but then you need someone who speaks to you. I never understood Occupy Wall Street. It was everywhere, and I didn't know what it is, and I live here. And this is a shame because people are trying to raise their voice, but no one is making a single sentence. And I believe if you really would like to be successful, from what I've seen, the biggest changes in the world started with leaders, good or bad, both. But I think you need a good-hearted person who speaks to you, who speaks in your interest. And it's not easy to find, but I think it's possible. But from what
Well, you should go down there and talk to them then.
No.
You're talking to us here, but that's not, you know, the point is they have an open format where you can go down
Yes, but
and
the problem is-
participate and get your message across. So, you know, they're working collaboratively. They don't have to have one voice. The point is that they're standing up to what's wrong in this society.
I do
And
understand.
they have time. It doesn't have, they don't have to decide tomorrow. It's going to take time. But the fact is they're mobilizing, they're using strategies every single day, they're getting together, they're having open democratic forums. That's how the change is going to happen. Somebody is not going to stand up like Che Guevara and say, I'm your hero, you've got to listen to what I'm saying.
No, of course
Okay.
not.
Why aren't they knocking on her door and talking?
Wait. Let's just let her finish. Let's let her finish, please. Okay.
May I just ask you, when I moved to the States, and I speak German, can I expect you to understand me? No. And I don't believe that if you have massive people, 300, 4,000 people, who speak maybe all at the same time, and they speak in a system, and we all live in a system, if you like it or not, and you know, I don't like it either, but the system we live in is a system that is built, it's so clear. You have your little parties, you have your little leaders, you go in your little boats, you go to the supermarket, you have a manager, you go to your political fraction, you have a president. Even for a football league, you have a president. It's such a simple form. But then, it's like speaking a different language. This is what I mean. I am not saying this is a good system. All I'm saying, if you'd like to be heard, maybe it would be smarter to also have your little leader so that those other little people take you a little serious. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's good or not. I'm just saying maybe you should consider speaking the language of someone else. And they would take it to your advantage. But you know, this is what I'm saying. Take it to your advantage. There's so many smart people here. This is what I'm saying. Just really just
Cool. So,
use what you know. It's just so sad to see it all go like goofy. Like that.
Well,
so you're saying a more conventional approach would be more effective?
I'm not saying a more conventional approach is good.
No, I know.
What you want is always other people to listen
Right,
to you.
right.
So if you have a bunch of people in a suit, wear a suit, go out there. What does it cost you? Be humble. What do you need? Do I need a hole in my jeans just because it's me? Shouldn't we be all over it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, but did you want to respond? I tend to agree with you. I agree with you, actually.
I feel like I'm not going to articulate this very well, so I apologize. But I feel like when the idea is corrupt and the way that our country is being run, the entire system is corrupt. And to then, at least how I feel about it, is to then go and cater to that system when you're trying to...
This is, you should film this. This is incredible. Oh, you got it.
No, I'm just saying, you were born and raised in a country that's supposedly free.
I was actually born that.
Okay, so you're the majority of the people. So who voted this? It's fucked up. It doesn't get fucked up from a day to the other, excuse my language. My parents are from Iran where they were forced. People were born at some place where they were like basically handcuffed all day and walking around like that. That's different. But people here had the choice. So how the hell did it happen to become like this?
Well, it's too complex. I mean, you can't, it'd take 4 years to have this discussion. I mean, we're trying to keep it about, this gentleman was an activist. These guys here are down there on Wall Street making something happen. We want to help them and we want to learn from them. I think that's why I'm here. I'm learning from them, I'm learning from these guys.
Did you want to say?
Yeah,
Stand up, stand up.
I disagree with all of those statements. And I think when you say, those things are what got us here sucks.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You said these things and these boats and these leaders, that's what got us here. Well, this place sucks. Where we're at sucks, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about it like a computer operating system, in terms of like the political and power systems that we're using, if you were running an operating system that fried your computer and shat on your face and threatened to kill your children, you would throw the thing out. Right? And so the operating system that functions on my iPhone gets updated every 2 months. And Congress and the stuff we're dealing with is like centuries old, right? And Occupy Wall Street is a rupture. And the best thing I've seen was written in Rolling Stone that said, if you can strike from culture, that's what this is. It's a strike from our own culture. And we don't know what we're doing. Nobody there does. But we're saying none of this is working. And if the one thing that doesn't work, it's power. And I think there is humility there. For you to say that people should don suits and be humble, that means you don't understand how
I didn't say people should wear suits. I'm saying we should all speak the same language.
But
and that and by being humble, I mean, if it means so much to you not wearing a suit, something is wrong too. What does it? Why do you care what you're wearing? This is what I'm saying. I'm not talking about clothes. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying if this is already an issue, how can you already go that big? If it's already an issue, what I'm wearing, what you're wearing, what he's wearing, how can you go that big? If this is already an issue.
Well, because it's a cultural change. That's an issue in our existing culture.
But what's the cultural change?
The cultural change is happening there. Like it's not an anti-power movement in the sense that most movements have been. It's actually an anti-power movement in the sense that they don't want anyone to have power. Do you know what I mean? Andrew, who I've been rooming with, who to me is a leader there, but totally rejects it, did one of his first media interviews and was really bashful about it because he doesn't like that he's getting attention for being involved. And his quote in that interview was, "This isn't a leaderless movement, it's a leaderful movement." And some of the humility I've seen, I saw a 19-year-old who's been there since the second day with Occupy tattooed on the inside of his leg. And I said, "What working groups do you function in?" And he said, "I don't participate in any working groups. All I do is clean up." That's him. He's serving. And that's a completely different language. But it's one that's sorely needed.
Right. Yes, we have people like this. This is exactly what I'm saying. We have people like this.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
One person
Thank you so much for coming.
You don't like it now myself, it's like, oh, finally, somebody is willing to stand up and say enough already. And so the Occupy movement has symbolized and spoken on behalf of
watching the food system, I get very excited about the whole localization of going back to a place that you say is yours, and you work in your own political context there. You work for people that you meet eye to eye, and that you have, you know, an anarchist potluck with, and then you see what's going on in your neighborhood like you're doing, Mark. And I am very hopeful about the localization of political action, and I'm really hopeful about the fact that, you know, Occupy Wall Street has been emulated. And how has it been? Well, it's been emulated in these, I mean, I looked at a map the other night, and like, there are small towns that are doing this. And it just gives me enormous, I know I sound like Pollyanna, but it just gives me enormous optimism.
Good. Okay, yes, 1, 2.
I just wanted to ask you, from someone who, with your background, and you're still active, and you still try to educate yourself, and how you kind of stay humble, and
How do I stay humble?
and how do you keep?
Some people would argue with you. But
Well, how do you keep in check? And,
you mean? Oh, I've accomplished so fucking much, you know.
well, not just that, but just more from like, how do you educate yourself, and you know, find something that you want to work towards, and at the same time keep in check self-righteous anger.
Anger tends toward being self-righteous.
How do you keep that?
Well, you know, my whole life, one issue has predominated, and it's militarism and war. You know, it just seemed to me from the time I was 18 years old, what a waste. You know, and the deeper I got into it, you know, sort of reading and stuff, talking to people, the more I realized it's a system. You know, and it's big. You know, I mean, it helped to live in New Mexico because the entire economy of New Mexico is based on military production. So you can see it. Although sometimes I think I'm the only person who sees it. You know, because there's a certain good German phenomenon where people don't want to see what's in front of them. But, you know, you have to pick your passion and educate yourself. As far as righteous anger, probably it's been my whole life trying to control the anger and seeing the terrible effects of it. You know, it's just like I wanted to express my anger and go out and bomb things. You know, but did that help anything? Not particularly. So, you know, it's like you know, as far as humility, you know, people think I'm an arrogant asshole. So I don't know. You just got to be real. You know, I think I suffered a lot of defeats in my life, and defeats are really good, and especially if you recognize that you messed up. You know, there are things that you could have done that were otherwise, and people were telling you, and the outcomes were predictable, and you could have done well. I happen to have made certain decisions in my life that had I made other decisions, people would still be alive. So I had to really think about this a lot. So
communities of color, especially based upon your work at the time, like its relationship to the Black Panthers, and especially with the Occupy movement, I feel a lot of people are very critical of it as another social movement that has a lot of white faces. And then there have been, you know, reactions to that in the Occupy the Hood, which I believe is founded in the Bronx. But the reaction, you know, of communities of color to say that we are part of the same sort of.
They say what?
That we are part of the same sort of, you know, questioning and resistance to, you know, like the same construction of power or dominant construction of power. But I guess my question is, you know, what do you think needs to be the role or outreach to communities of color in general, particularly the Black community in the U.S., in like creating social movement and especially the Occupy?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that historically, in the things I've been involved in, the divisions have kept us from being powerful. You know, and we are a very segregated society, even here, you know, socially segregated. Still, everywhere in the whole United States. So this is not a simple question, but I understand that Occupy Wall Street has actually taken this on pretty well. Is it your assessment that they have? Occupy Wall Street.
Well, I'm not someone who's present there, but I know that it's something that, has been addressed, but I know it's something that many people are still critical of, and many leaders in communities of color, are still critical of. And why there are these fringe movements like Occupy the Hood to say that we have the same stakes to make, but we have to make them in our own, in our own space, and where there's a different, almost cultural value and significance that doesn't relate to, white middle class culture and that same sort of white middle class activism by young people. Because it's the same question in your poverty, and something needs to change, but we are vocalizing it in a way culturally and socioeconomically meaningful to us. That's my,
Marla.
Sorry.
No.
Just in the couple of days that we've been here and experienced what's happening, there, despite what y'all might think, you do have a culture associated with this movement, and a very definitive one. And one that, I've done rural organizing in the arid West for 40 years, and they all think the same things everybody at Occupy Wall Street thinks, but they wouldn't be able to relate to this movement. And they're not going to be twinkling. Cowboys aren't going to be twinkling, and they're not going to be...
I'd like to see some cowboys twinkling. There's a lot of gay cowboys in there. No.
But it's the same thing as relates to what you're talking about, because I don't want to get hung up on the clothes thing, but you don't show up as a young white organizer in a black church and not be dressed properly. It goes to what you were saying. And so if you're interested in expressing yourself, you have a fabulous movement, and it will be fabulous for a long time, and it will continue to make a significant statement. But in terms of relating to the rest of the country, to the rest of the very many cultures and subcultures we have in this country, it's doubtful. And so somebody's going to have to start being, organizers or community organizers are always invisible. It's not something that Occupy Wall Street thought of. Most of the movements in this country have been organized by people who don't have public names, who are invisible. And that's how it usually works best, because we want to have people feel that they own their own movements. So if that happens, and it can hook up to the youth movement here in New York or in Oakland, it'd be great. But there's a huge country in the middle. And they have a very different set of values and a very different set of interacting and a very different protocol for how they treat one another in their communities. And it's what Jan was saying, there's a wide variety of communities. And in order for this thing to work, they all have to be a part of it. So I just beg people to learn how to put away their own egos and their own cultural manifestations, which I know everybody holds dear, and figure out how to relate to the rest of the country.
In other words, check and see whether your self-expression is strategic or not. Now, just in terms of a short answer to your question, I was talking with some young non-white organizers in Albuquerque about the question of Occupy Wall Street. In Albuquerque, it's called Unoccupy Albuquerque. And they said to me, these people are not aware of the organizing that's been going on. They felt that they had just been ignored. Yeah, over this, right? And that was their response. So I'm going to convey that to you. So I would suggest that it might be a good thing to find out what organizing is going on in the non-white communities. This evening has been an absolute joy to me to be able to sit and talk, about all these things with people. I love your analogy. If an operating system was broke, you'd throw it out. I mean, it's an insight into your thinking, It's important, you know, but I don't know the buts. But anyway, our ability to, this is very rare to be able to sit in a room, even in New York, and interchange in this way. And I was able to tell you my little story, and you were able, people asked, you know, it was great. So thank you very much. Jacques,
thank you so much.
The yes man did it again.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing, and I think we could go on till 2 in the morning at
Well,
least.
yeah, we'll occupy the room.
Yeah, we can just occupy it. But
When's the next one?
the next one I think is next week. Look at if you want. Yes.
The next one is next week.
Oh, week after. It's the week after
And
Thanksgiving.
what is it? What is it?
It's Gabriella Coleman talking about Anonymous and the hacker.
Oh. Whoa.
And so that's, and if there's one after that as well, but yeslab.org/CAT for Creative Activism Thursdays.